mix of foreign experts and Indian experts, some Indian experts working abroad. So we have had a very good mix of the best minds to come and speak to us on the most important policy issues for our country. As you know, EGROW Foundation is a policy-oriented think tank which has faith in research-based policy advice, and these issues are very important to us. It is in this very context that we have organized today's webinar. In today's webinar, the issue that is being discussed is lockdown. There's been a global discussion on this. Has it been the useful tool or has it not been a useful tool? Even in our own country, there has been a discussion on this. To chair the session today, we have Dr. Partha, who's most important, my friend. He's the director of National Institute of Bank Management, Pune. His research interests are macroeconomics, monetary issues. His beautiful small booklet on monetary policy is so elegant. I would recommend everybody to read that book. It's very good. And at IIM Bangalore, I used to refer it to all my students. Very precise, but very, very good book. He was my colleague at the Reserve Bank of India, where we worked together for long years. He was also the advisor at the International Monetary Fund in Washington, D.C. And most importantly, he was a professor of economics at Indian Institute of Management, Calcutta, before he took over this assignment at IIM, at NIPM. With this, I hand over the session to Dr. Partha to conduct the proceedings. Dr. Partha.
Thank you so much, Dr. Charan Singh, President of the EGROW Foundation, Mr. Madan Sabnavis, Chief Economist of Bank of Baroda, and today's main speaker, Mr. Devi Prasad, economist and former civil servant. It's great to see all of you here. I mean, we had met in some occasions. I missed Mr. Devi Prasad by 3 years in the IMFED's office. I was fondly remembering that. I'm extremely happy to be here in this EGROW webinar series where Mr. Madan Sabnavis is going to give a presentation on his recent book, Lockdown or Economic Destruction. It's published by Atlantic Publishers, and Mr. Devi Prasad will be discussing the book. Let me begin with at least introducing Mr. Sabnavis. Mr. Sabnavis, currently, he is the Chief Economist, Bank of Baroda. He did his BA Honours in Economics from St. Stephen's College, an MA from Delhi School of Economics. He has been a professional corporate economist since '87, and he has worked erstwhile with number of institutions like ICICI Limited, ICICI Bank, L&T, NCDX, Care Ratings. In this 34 years of career in various fields, he had wide experience in various industries and developed a deep understanding of the practical aspects of the subject. And I find him to be quite a nonconformist, and hence, as a contrarian, he tended to question and be critical rather than eulogize policies which are done well by other opinion-driven sort of establishment economists. He has published over more than 2,500 articles in newspapers and publications like Financial Express, Mint, Business Standard, Business Line, Indian Express, Free Press Journal, and Economic Times. I have followed his columns regularly. He's the author of 4 books entitled Macroeconomics Demystified, Economic Course, Economics of India, How to Fool All People for All Times, and Hits and Misses, The Indian Banking Story. I'm told his other interests are English literature, classical music, and New Age Western music, and some of which it gets reflected in the current book as well. I understand that my primary role is that of a timekeeper, but to begin with, let me have just one preliminary remark spanned over 4 cohesive sections, namely experience, macroeconomic effects, policy approach, and ruminations. The essays in this collection, which obviously could have sprang from his regular columns, they have elements of mixing the sublime with the mundane. Why do I say mundane? In some sense, many of these essays give a commentary on a contemporary event. But again, in doing that, he makes it sublime. It brings out the medium to longer term implication and many of the policy interventions. Without further ado, I request Mr. Sabnavis to make his presentation. If it is agreeable and Mr. Sabnavis can speak for Charan around 40 minutes, is that okay? Or tell me how much time?
Maybe even less than that, maybe 30 minutes, we can have a discussion, I think.
And then maybe I'll make a remarks of 5 minutes, and then Mr. Devi can make his remarks for 10 minutes, and we will have Q&A after that. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So over to you, Mr. Sabnavis.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Ray and Dr. Charan Singh for having me here. And, this particular book was written by me starting from June onwards. So we had this lockdown in March 2020. And I think at that point of time, I think almost all of us were grappling with what is the lockdown, what is it that we can do, what is it we cannot do. And I never really thought that this would be something which would carry on the way in which it did, and that it would be worthy of putting down thoughts, putting down my emotions, as well as drawing certain economic implications from the lockdown. So it was probably, so that's some parts of it is something which one would find in the initial chapters of the book, where I'm talking of ground level experiences, where I think all of us were affected in some way or the other in the first round of COVID and the lockdown, where there was severe restrictions on our movement. And we had seen that supply chains got affected everywhere, and we had a problem even in terms of procuring our necessities. We didn't have the house support, the home support, which we had, because people were not allowed to move around. Of course, there were different stories which came from different parts of the country, and depending upon which place one stayed in, one was affected in a differential manner. Now, for example, I live here in Mumbai, and I saw that there were severe restrictions on what could be done, what could not be done. And I was definitely impacted by even in running my normal daily activities. Of course, there was work from home, so all of us were working from home, and we in the financial sector were not too much affected because we were getting our salaries on time. We were doing our work through Zoom calls, and we were coordinating with our team members, our colleagues. There wasn't too much of a problem, but newspapers were out of reach, so therefore there were no newspapers coming. One had to keep following various websites and see what was happening around us. And that was something which, of course, did catch my interest, because I kept just generally following what was happening, what was being reported. There were intermittent studies being carried out by different organizations about how the lockdown was affecting us. So those were things which were at the back of my mind. Now, somewhere around 2020, the month of June, I had a personal experience, something which was a tragedy, because this was a time when my father, who was 90 years old, had certain recurring ailments, and I was looking to admit him in a hospital. We stayed, ironically, near a five-star hospital called Lilavati Hospital in Mumbai. That's where my parents stayed. And some of the top hospitals, Hinduja Hospital is close by. We also have the Holy Family Hospital close by. There was Jambani Hospital in Andheri. So he had an ailment which had nothing to do with COVID, because he was ensconced in his house, and there was hardly anybody coming. He was staying with my mother, and then my brother and I would keep meeting him off and on every week to make sure that whatever had to be done was being done. And then suddenly, when he developed an ailment, we realized that no doctor would come and see him, because doctors said that we cannot come out. We are too scared to come. We contacted all the hospitals, and the hospital said, look, sorry, a 90-year-old man who's not suffering from COVID, we are not taking any risk of taking him, because if he gets COVID, you will blame us. And on the other hand, if he comes in and, we don't really have beds to service non-COVID patients. So quite expectedly, I think nothing could be done. We were helpless, and my father expired. And we couldn't do anything. The only time we could move out of the house was when we could go for the funeral. Even there were lots of restrictions which were there about what we could do, what we could not do. And ironically, this was the time when we had the unlock system had actually started from 1st June. So 1st June was when unlock started. On 8th of June, my father expired. And that was a time when I actually thought that, look, something is wrong somewhere. Are we doing the right things? It's one thing to say that we have one of our leaders coming in saying that buying vessels, put on lights, put off the candles. Uh, this was, how does one really interpret this? The government said that you start, we have a lockdown, you can't do anything. Then at some point of time, you suddenly say that, look, we're opening up the economy. And when you were opening up the economy, you read the newspaper, not the newspapers, the online versions, and you get to know that the COVID cases were actually increasing. So when we had the lockdown, there were hardly hundreds of cases. Then that became 50,000 by the time we decided to unlock. So what really was happening? Was it a case of saying that did we really understand what was happening? Did the government know what it was doing? Or was it just a case of saying that, look, we have something called COVID, we don't know what to do about it? In other countries, the Western countries, the decision was taken that you keep people indoors, lock them up, and hope that things do settle down. And there was this magical number given saying that for 3 weeks we have a lockdown. The theory was at that point of time that if all of us stayed indoors for 3 weeks, nobody would move out. And those who got COVID would have gotten themselves admitted in the hospital, and the others would actually have been protected forever. So, but 3 weeks became another 3 weeks. It kept getting extended, and we reached a stage where I think, honestly, nobody knew what could be done, what was really happening around us. Everybody became an expert in terms of how one should be tackling COVID, and I think we somehow lost the plot. And why did it affect the government? My sense was that you suddenly realized after 2 months that your revenue stopped flowing in. So the government didn't have money to pay salaries. The government did not have money. When I say government, it's the larger government I'm talking of, not just the center, even the state governments. So we had this ironical situation where I think the Delhi government had said that, look, you want liquor, we will deliver it home, because there was a lot of revenue to be earned from the duties on liquor. And when the government saw that their pockets were being affected and they were not able to run their administration in whichever way it was, then it was necessary for one to unlock it. So that's when I started going back and looking, doing some kind of research about whatever information could be collated based on different studies carried out, some of them by the industry organizations like FICCI. And there were, of course, a lot of done by the NGOs, including the Azim Premji University. I think there were lots of these surveys carried out. And then we actually got insights about, one, what we were hearing regularly on television, where we were told that everything is coming under control, and there were threats, warnings being given to people that we all need to behave ourselves, and that everything was going according to plan, though one was not quite sure what the plan was. And since I used to make these regular visits, I stay in one part of Mumbai, my parents used to stay in another part of Mumbai, so traveling, we would suddenly come across some of these railway stations, Bandra railway station, where one fine day when I was going past to realize that there were thousands of people who were lined up there, and there was a lathi charge going on. I had no courage actually to stop, because I thought probably even I will be beaten up if I stopped anywhere close to it. So I go back to my mom's place, and later on making inquiries, talk to some of the media people. And they say there's this problem of migrants, because there was some message which was spread saying that the government was allowing all the migrants to go home. And therefore, all the people in Mumbai, lots of them are concentrated in this area called Dharvi, which is actually one of the major centers of the SME enterprises. There's a lot of these workers, lots of these tiny enterprises which flourish in this, probably one of the largest slums in the world, second largest in the world, I believe. So all these people were trying to rush home, and you suddenly realized there was no trains which were operating. And these people stayed on for around 1 or 2 weeks before they were literally lathi charged and forced to get out of the railway premises. And so there were two parts. There was one thing that the government was desperately trying to help out everyone. They were having these special train services so that the migrants could go back. But were the migrants really able to go back? So wherever I got a chance, I used to start talking to people on my journeys just within Bombay itself. So some people would say that, look, we have gotten our ticket, we're going, and we have found out from our relatives that once you get onto a train, it's fine. You're looked after fairly well by the Indian Railways. Food is provided, water is provided. Somebody else said that, look, we get onto a train and we're not quite sure what happens to us. Midway through, the train stops working. So we've gotten these kind of ghastly stories. There's no water. It's the May heat, the June heat, we really didn't know what our relatives didn't know what to do. So there were kind of mixed stories also coming about. And then, of course, we read certain things in certain publications about migrants walking all the way back, walking along railway tracks. So there was a lot of suffering, with human suffering, which people went through, where probably most of us out here who are definitely a part of the well-off part of society. We were in our homes, probably had air conditioners on. We might have complained that we were not having access to mangoes during the season, but we really did not have the kind of hardship that the common man had. So I'm giving this background because when I'm talking of the sections which I really tried to cover in terms of what was really happening at the ground level, these were things which one saw, one spoke to, and I was regularly in touch with my media friends who tried to get onto the road wherever possible, both in Mumbai as well as in Delhi. And so you kept getting these kind of the feedback about what was really happening. And things were not really uniform. It's surprisingly, we had seen that it was more a metropolitan phenomenon where people were subjected to more hardships. Because I do have certain contacts through my wife who's from Dehradun. We found that in Dehradun, conditions were so much different. There were fewer restrictions. Of course, people were better disciplined. There were restrictions in the sense that you had to wear on mask, shops were open or not open, they had fixed timings. But definitely the way in which the administration dealt with the people was quite different. Similarly, we have certain relatives who are staying in South, in places like Chennai and Bangalore. There also we got the stories that people were more humanitarian. So the way in which administrations behave was quite different. So the basic point which I try to bring out here in some of the chapters is that because of the federal system which we had, there was a lot of disconnection between what the central government said. So the central government said you can have newspapers, but my society out here said no newspapers can be delivered. Central government said there were certain things which could be done. The state government said that you cannot do it. The municipal government, that is at the municipal level, we had Mumbai Municipal Corporation saying certain other things could not be done. And then we had the police, which was a different authority, a law to itself, obviously being the law. They decided to interpret the way things they wanted to. So we would be getting quite a few of these ordinary street vendors who used to come and normally supply goods just outside our house, vegetables, and maybe some of these smaller goods. And then they would be complaining, look, I can come only once because we can't go to the mandi because we're being beaten up when we go there. So what does a vegetable or a fruit dealer do? So these were the kind of problems which were there. And they have been documented in the sense that there have been quite a few studies which were carried out by different organizations. And this is what we also got to know, that conditions were really bad when it came to the people from the lower income strata. So I think that's the problem which we have in India, that we had demonetization. Whom did it affect? Okay, all of us I felt very uncomfortable, but I was not really affected by it. But you talk to the poorer people, the people with the lower income groups who were living on cash, they suddenly realized that they had major hardships. And we realized, and I do recollect when people died, people said, look, this is but natural. If a few old people were struggling, standing to change their notes, they died. No, it's a part of the system. It's a part of the sacrifice which is being done for this greater good of getting hold of black money. Similarly, even when you're talking of the lockdown and the kind of suffering, which again, it was the people of lower income groups who were affected. The justification is that, look, this is something which was new for all of us. It happened in US, it happened in Europe, it happened in every country. So we did just what the other countries had to do, because do you have a better solution? Could we have planned things better? No, nobody had time to plan. So it's one thing to say that what was done was not correct, but was there a solution, an alternative which was there? Well, none of us really know what was the alternative. But the important question is, so that's another thing which I've tried to capture out here, is that we had this concept of periodic lockdowns, and then we had the second lockdown, which happened in 2021. Now, did our mindset actually change when we had a new challenge coming from a new wave of COVID? Now, the only common thread which one saw all through was that there was the usual panic which came from the point of view of the government and different states. So the center actually said we should not be stopping activity. The economy should function. We should not really come in the way, follow the COVID norms. So the center got out of it, and then it was left to the states to administer, to decide as to what was the right thing. And I think this became very, very haphazard. So for even people like us who are in the better off stature of society, we realized that if I had to travel from Mumbai to Delhi, Delhi would say that you need to get an RT-PCR if you're coming from a particular state. If you were going to Calcutta, they said, look, you don't need to do it. You go to another place like Karnataka, for a very long time, they said, if you're coming from Delhi, Maharashtra, you need to have an RT-PCR. If you're coming from other states, you don't have to. So there was absence of coordination. There was absence of direction when it came to these periodic lockdowns based on how the regional or the state government interpreted the state of affairs. So it does look like that we haven't really grappled with this particular situation of what should one do when you have such kind of situation. Admittedly, the third lockdown or the third wave, which we had late in November, December of 2021, it didn't really affect people. It wasn't really that threatening. So we did not have any serious lockdowns. So if you look at the services sector, keep talking to the restaurant people, you talk to people in the tourism area, or the theaters, the malls, I think they were still affected. The immediate thing was high contact services have to be closed down. And that was a kind of a solution. So it looked like that our reaction to a new wave of COVID, which we thought we understood, but finally realized we did not, was to simply say that let's stop people from moving around. And even in terms of human beings as such, I think either it was a case of fatigue or maybe the case of saying that who cares? Anyway, things are happening. None of us have any control over it. So therefore, the people also became very, very lax when it came to observing COVID norms, which we see even today. So I believe just last month, we had another maybe minor wave of COVID in Delhi. Now they're saying there's something which is happening in Mumbai. There's already talk of saying that we should ask for masks. I won't be surprised at some point in time, they will say we once again close down the services in case the numbers start increasing and we have cases of hospitalization which takes place. So this is just one part of the story which I've tried to highlight. This is based on my own personal experiences as well as what close following of what various studies which were carried out at that point of time did show. Since, as I told you, it was based on a bit of emotion, since I was personally impacted by this, there could be a sense at certain points of time I may have gone overboard in terms of saying that the government was wrong in doing what it did. But if, as a rational being, you ask me, okay, do you have a solution even today? Well, probably I don't have a solution even today. I will have to say that I really don't know what should be done in case we have it. We have seen in the West, as we have had these phases of lockdown, people have been protesting against it. Governments have been reacting in a different way. And universally, I think it's generally felt that we do not stop economic activity. We let normalcy rule as far as possible. So that's one part of the story. So it's based on experiences, based on surveys which other people have carried out, which have been reported. The sources have all been given so that there's no tendency for exaggeration. So views may be emotional or exaggerated, but definitely the facts are something which are based on people at the ground level who have carried out these surveys. So even for something like migrants, there are studies which were carried out to show that while the official stance was that lots of people did benefit, lots of migrants did benefit, but talking to migrants, especially in the northern part of the country, since that was where people do move from Uttar Pradesh and Bihar to the rest of the country, people going back, they faced a large amount of hardships and lots of things which were said, which was being done by the governments, like the camps which were set up, did not really function the way in which it has been projected. So that's something which towards the end, actually, I've kept something open saying the views for and against the lockdown. And this is a more theoretical way and a very unbiased way of saying that, look, these are the reasons for it, these are the reasons against it. And you as a reader may actually decide as to whether what we did was the right thing. So there's no question of me deciding for you as to whether the lockdown was right or wrong. That comes somewhere towards the end of the book, And then as an economist, there has been a pure macroeconomic impact of the lockdown, which has been analyzed. I think the focus of the book has been on that particular section, where one can look at the different variables of the economy and examine as to how the economy was affected, that particular part of the economy got affected on account of the lockdown. This could be our GDP, which for the very first time in recorded memory, we had gone into a negative growth rate. Similarly, we had a case of employment. Lots of us would have seen I don't know what your background is, but since I've been in the corporate sector, so a number of my colleagues, friends in different parts of industry have lost their jobs. Lots of people have taken pay cuts. And there was this very interesting thing that you have companies which earn profits of 50,000, 60,000 crores and have a wage bill of maybe 5,000 crores. They still indulge in saying that people have to take a wage cut, a salary cut of 50%. So I could never understand it. I've been in the corporate sector. This is where you think this is always this capitalist greed. You keep talking of shareholders' value. The shareholder doesn't get the 50,000 crores. It goes into the reserves. But companies were not willing to compromise of saying that even though I'm so wealthy, I will still keep cutting it. In fact, what I've also narrated out here is the entire media. I think various publications, the publication houses, everybody went in for pay cuts. Lots of editions of newspapers were closed down, which meant that the entire staff had to go home and nothing was being paid to them. So in terms of employment, again, a formal study has also been done out here, looking at annual reports of companies and seeing as to how did the headcount move. You'll realize that most of the services sector headcount actually came down. If you looked at the only sectors which were doing well were IT and the financial sector. Why? Because financial sector was able to operate almost at full capacity. When I say full capacity in terms of business, even work from home did not really come in the way. And I think the credit goes to technology. Similarly, if you look at the IT sector, that's something which did well. The FMCG sector did well. We saw the pharmaceutical company that doing well, but the rest of the companies actually started laying off staff. So this is something which is actually presented in pure number form. So it's not based on experience or based on hearsay or what studies have shown or what I've heard on telephone. It's more a case of looking at annual reports of companies and really coming out of that. And another interesting part is when looking at corporate performance, we saw that in the first quarter, corporate performance, sales fell, profits fell, everything was bad. By the time we came to the second quarter, we saw sales fell, but profits improved. How did profits improve? The profits improved primarily because companies cut back on the wage bill. They cut back on human beings. They cut down on salaries. So we had this anomaly saying that the corporate sector actually performed well during the COVID year. If I look at the entire year, it was not because of the top line, but it was more a case of saying that the bottom line improved because of cut in costs, and the costs which were impacted were essentially the labor costs. So that was another interesting thing which came up. Now, today, for example, when we are talking of the economy coming out of a slump, we have realized how difficult it is. Now, I believe there have been certain studies done by the RBI itself, which is very interesting because when they actually spoke in the report on currency and finance to say that when will India's GDP growth actually go back to normal? See, we normally say one year we fell by around 6.5% or maybe 7% in 2021. 21-22, of course, will be a nice number of close to 9%. But if you see the kind of loss which took place, the amount of displacement which took place in labor, I think recuperating it is not just a statistical phenomenon. And the kind of loss which was calculated quite well, there's nothing proved in the book, but since I did talk about the loss in GDP, if you actually see what could have been the compounded growth rate in case the economy grew at a normal rate in 2021, it would actually mean that we have lost quite a few years of growth. So even today, with this bit of hubris, we keep talking of 5 trillion economy, how soon we're going to achieve. I think we are running away from the fact that things would have been much better in case this part of the lockdown was handled in a better manner, in case we really had more support coming from the government. Now, this is where I've tried to look at what is it that the Indian government has done in order to look at the lockdown, and what is it that the Western nations have done. So here we see that there's been a clear difference in the approach. I won't say anything is right or wrong because I think every government has the right to choose the path. But I think what the Indian government has done is they're focused more in terms of policy rather than, let's say, a stimulus in the form of providing measures which actually help to propel the economy immediately. There was a lot of good which was done in terms of helping out the poor, at least statistically. Forget about the anecdotes which have been said, which everything may not have worked out the way. But if the government spent a lot in giving free food for the people, for the poor, which is still carrying on even today, I think that's a very commendable thing. But in terms of giving any kind of tax cuts or giving in terms of cash transfers in order to bolster the economy, that is something which the government did not really do. So when we looked at the entire Atmanirbhar package, so there is an analysis which has been done saying that, okay, we announced something like 20 lakh crores to begin with, and it was increased subsequently. But most of those were imputed values. A lot of it came from the point of view of the Reserve Bank of India, providing liquidity to the system, providing, let's say, what you call the insurance to the SMEs under the ECLGS scheme, the credit guarantee which was provided. All that is very good. In fact, we had carried out quite a few studies, surveys with the SMEs, and the SME says that giving credit is very good for us, but my major problem is on the demand side. So I think that has been the issue, saying that we have been tackling a demand side problem more from the supply side. So it does help. Yes, definitely the SMEs were better off, but did it actually help to get the labor back? Did it help to get the demand back? Did it help to get the receivables paid on time? That was not really the case. So again, there is a section which talks about how the SMEs have been impacted. So while a lot of help came in the form of the credit form, but otherwise, I think they were left high and dry. And that's going to be a problem for us even today, because we all know of the numbers as to how important the SMEs are from the point of view of economic growth. But if I have to look forward, even today, most of them are struggling to stand on their feet. Lots of them have actually closed down. So, and to top it all, I think we're looking at our export sector, which is heavily being propelled by the SMEs. This is a sector which is also going to get affected if we are not able to get our SMEs back on their feet. So this is another aspect which has been looked at in certain detail as to how the SMEs have been affected, and whether at all what we have done in terms of a response. So I would also admit very much that I think one of the international rating agencies has actually commended the government of India for saying that they did not go overboard in terms of the stimulus, that they were very much guarded, and therefore we continued retaining our rating at BBB minus. There was no downgrade done to it. But personally, I would have felt that a little more push given actually directly to, in terms of higher spending, in terms of giving tax breaks, would have really helped even the middle class. So the poor were actually given food, just allowing you to survive. But if you really had to keep the economy going, I think that kind of a fiscal push was required. But somehow I think we have it in our mind, FRBM is important. We need to stick to those fiscal deficit numbers. And therefore, we did not really do what we could have possibly done in order to make sure that the slide was not bad. And I think more than the slide, as I was saying, is that we have lost a lot of time. Because if we had managed a better performance in 2021, the base for building further growth in the coming years, starting from 21-22, could have been accelerated. So that's another area which has been brought in. And then there was this other thing which I've looked at the very first time that we saw that the center and the states could be having a clash was because of the GST. Because when you have a lockdown, I think it's but natural that if economic activity comes to an end, people are not allowed to spend, so we don't spend. So what happens is that, of course, all of us complain that we are not able to do what we want to do, and therefore we get affected. But the government also suffers because the revenue comes down. So I think that's what we saw in the GST collections. And when the GST collections come down, we had this entire drama which came about whether how could the states be compensated. So I think there was a lot of clash which was there between the center and the states. The center said that I never collected money, so how can I give it to you? And the GST agreement was that we have a compensation cess. If I'm able to collect it, I will give it to you. But it doesn't say anything about what if I don't get any collections, I cannot possibly give it to you. And I think finally the center had to relent, but I think it created quite a few awkward moments. I think for almost a month, there was quite a bit of bickering going on between the center and the states about the GST compensation. And finally, it was decided that who will borrow it? It'll be the center which will be borrowing. And that's another interesting thing which came about one of the major contradictions, because when the GST was drawn up, it was said for 5 years there will be a 14% growth assumed in the revenue, and accordingly, if there's any shortfall, there will be a compensation coming from the center. And at that particular point of time, nobody really thought that we would have a situation where the state is not able to earn revenue, and even the center will not be able to earn revenue, and there will be no revenue which can actually be shared. Okay, I need to earn in order to share, but if I don't earn, I can't possibly share. So that's another kind of a contradiction which did come up. And And as far as the RBI, I think the RBI did the heavy lifting. And I think that's again been a problem, something which I've not been able to address because I think the book had gone for print. It took almost a year because COVID actually came in the way. So one could not really get into it. But today, the kind of problem which we are seeing that the RBI has in terms of surplus liquidity. So we had injected a lot of liquidity into the system when nobody wanted it. So it's a case of saying that all of us are diabetic patients and there's lots of sugar, sweets kept in front of us. What do we do about it? I just look at it. And now we're saying that there's so much of liquidity in the system, there's need for one to draw back. And our kind of liquidity is quite different from the liquidity of the QE, which we had in the West. Because in the QE, what really happened was that I bought bonds and the bonds matured and that's the tightening takes place. They're not rebought. Okay, then that's how the QE ends. Whereas in India, we have all these LTROs which came through. There's lots of money which has been given, and banks perforce had to take those securities. So you borrow at 4% repo and you invest in a reverse repo at 3.35%. Not really an optimal situation, but we have this huge overload of 5 to 6 lakh crores of surplus liquidity which resides, and nobody really knows what has to be done about it. A lot of this money is one of the reasons people say is we have high inflation is because of this high liquidity. But how do we really suck out liquidity? So the long and short is that quite a few of these measures which we have taken not only has impacted the future growth prospects which we're talking of, but also in terms of these major monetary problems which we have. That's something which has erupted right now. Similarly, we have given a moratorium. We also went ahead and did some one-time restructuring. Now, the question is that given the current situation where we've had a war situation where the world economy has again gone into a spin, what happens once the restructuring term ends? Are we again running the risk of another set of NPAs which are going to rise, especially when I'm talking of the SMEs? So it's been a case of kicking the can. Because I always believe in the financial sector, you have a moratorium, do restructuring. It's just a case of deferring the issue. Because I remember even when we had the NPA issue, I remember we had these restructured assets. So instead of calling it an NPA, I call it a restructured asset. Now the restructured assets, at some point of time, it sort of fell back on our face. We had this AQR, which Dr. Raghuram Rajan had introduced, NPA suddenly spiral. So this could be another problem ahead. Right now, I'm not in a position to comment. None of us know how well are these companies or these accounts really functioning, the ones which have been restructured. But that is something which could, when we go ahead, that could be another problem which we have. So just before I conclude, I think, as I mentioned earlier, that this entire exercise was based both as written as an economist, with a bit of emotion also. So tended to be a bit harsh at certain points of time. But if I look back now and say that maybe, yes, was there an alternative way of handling such a situation? One really doesn't know. Probably today we may do it in a more mature manner. We will not be closing down. We'll be a bit more attuned towards human beings and make sure that people don't lose their jobs. People are treated in a better manner. But one really doesn't know. So at the end of it, if at all one does get to read this book, it would be nice if you could form your own judgment and probably let me know whether how exactly does one evaluate this entire bit of lockdown. Was it a case of on the human part? And second, of course, the economic part. Economic part, of course, becomes more obvious because it's more objective. What we are going through today is because of what we did 2 years back, or even for a full year. And in terms of how the economy has been affected, the amount of time we're taking to recover, a whole segment called the SMEs which have been affected, lots of jobs which are being lost. And and the way in which we also conduct our business has changed. In fact, I have another chapter in this particular book where I talk about how industries have to reinvent themselves. So we've all seen that this particular meeting, which maybe if we held it 2 years back on a different subject, we would all be sitting in Delhi in a particular room and doing it. Whereas today we're doing everything on the web. Okay, we would probably have been conducting it in a hotel. So I think the entire hotel business today, when you talk of it, lots of these conferences, seminars, corporate meets, things are starting right now, but you talk to the hotel industry and they will tell you that things are nowhere close to what they were earlier. Similarly, if you look at the kind of way in which we are focusing a lot on technology, there's a major threat which is there in a country like India, a labor surplus economy like India, that human beings may become less relevant because we have found solutions through technology. So that's another aspect on the economic part which has been touched upon, where I do feel that the entire way in which we do business will be changing substantially. And lots of businesses will have to reorient themselves, will have to strategize in a different manner. Even a small thing like, not a small thing, it's a big thing like real estate. We have seen the entire commercial real estate sector has gone into a spin because lots of companies are withdrawing from their office spaces because everybody is having a concept of saying that part of the people work from home. And I know of large companies which have given up their office spaces. There's lots of empty spaces which are available, new constructions which came up prior to the pandemic. They're going at a very low rate. There are no buyers, takers for it, because everybody has realized there are lots of gains to be had by having a work from home culture. So these are certain kind of changes which we'll have to see how they evolve, whether at all we go back to the pre-pandemic situation. My sense is that probably this will not happen. The industries will have to, or rather companies will have to re-innovate. You will have to look at different ways of doing your business, and the old style of thing is going to change substantially. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. That was a very brilliant exposition of what's there in the book. What I like most about the book is in the book, the author does not take almost a post-truth stance. I mean, we have been now exposed to various forms and shapes of post-truth stance. So at least I'm very, very happy to see that this does not take that, where in the post-truth world, conclusions are written prior to the event. It offers, to me at least, a menu of intellectual skepticism of very, very classical variety about a recent event. Is as if, I'm reminded of Lewis Carroll in Alice in Wonderland, and I quote, "It would be so nice if someone made sense for a change." So I would appreciate really the author's effort that he's making a sense of this whole thing. On a lighter note, the other thing I liked about the book is the contextual quotes at the beginning of the chapters. It's so refreshing to see that Pink Floyd coexist with Linkin Park, Adam Smith with Keynes, and Ronald Reagan with Sir Humphrey Appleby of US Prime Minister fame. That was very refreshing to see. Of course, on a more serious note, pandemic is once a century event. I was looking at the numbers. The global growth is lowest over the period 1960 to 21, for which reliable data exists. But with less reliable data, there's the lowest growth since World War II. For India too, the GDP growth in 2021 is lowest since 50-51. So that's once in a century, once in 50 years kind of a phenomenon. Also, this is the first pandemic in the globalized world, because if you think of plague, the way it got spread over is different way. It got only spread over to the port cities. Whereas this is a globalized world, it became much more contagious. Of course, the source of the current crisis and the solution has to be biology, and therefore it has to be in terms of inventing vaccines and containment of spread. Lockdown is perhaps some sort of a sledgehammer strategy to reduce the spread. And I'm happy that Mr. Sabnavis did not adhere to the false sense of dichotomy of life versus livelihood, which we heard many a time during this period. Of course, pandemic posed us with many riddles of economic outcomes. I'll take a very narrow version. Mr. Sabnavis has told a number of human stories which are extremely valid, and they are serious issues, particularly when it gets translated into employment numbers. But the first one, without belittling the human tragedy of the pandemic, one should remember the pandemic interestingly involved both a demand and a supply shock. So in our economics 101, the aggregate demand curve and the aggregate supply curve both shifted adversely, and therefore demand shocks came up as people lost their income, they got their pink slips, consumption, investment, foreign trade. The three elements of effective demand all suffered. Now, supply too was affected, the result of the lockdown, and sectors like trade, hotels restaurants came to a standstill. Because of these twin shocks, depending on the relative strength of the demand vis-a-vis supply shock, one tends to get a peculiar situation of lower output and higher price. This is possibly the first major economic riddle posed by the pandemic. Second riddle is perhaps, Mr. Sabnavis did not refer to it in his exposition. What he says, grand design and apology of the stimulus, where an increasing number of pandemic deaths were accompanied by exuberant asset prices. If one just plots in US the number of deaths related to pandemic on the x-axis and on the y-axis put the Dow Jones, there is a positive relation. That's created what perhaps it was created by what Sabnavis says about liquidity deluge. I won't speak further. I enjoyed browsing over the book. I'm yet to read it much more thoroughly. Therefore, I'm not competent to summarize the book, which contains multiple analytical ideas and commentaries on a contemporary Indian economy. Therefore, I will now request Mr. Devi Prasad, economist and former civil servant, to make his discussion remarks. But before he does so, let me introduce him briefly. Mr. Devi Prasad retired from the Indian Economic Service of Government of India after illustrious service of over 30 years. He was a founding director of Fiscal Policy Institute, Bangalore, Government of Karnataka, and has served as an advisor to Executive Director at the IMF, Washington, D.C. He carries technical and administrative experience from Department of Economic Affairs, Department of Commerce, Forward Markets Commission, Minister of Rural Development, Minister of Health and Family Welfare. The experience is very, very rich. He holds a PG diploma in public policy from George Mason, MPhil in public administration, Punjab University, LLB from Mumbai University, and PG diploma in population studies in CDS Trivandrum, apart from others. He has been delivering lectures to a number of places on fiscal policy, budget management, macro management, public policy. Without further ado, I'll request Mr. Devi Prasad to take over and make his discussions. You are mute, possibly.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ray. It is good to hear my introduction, which I have forgotten for past 10 years.
Blame it on the date. Blame it on the date.
And I thank Mr. Sabnavis and Mr. Charan, my good friend from Bangalore days, for giving this book. I particularly thank because I reverted to reading a hard copy after 2 years. Otherwise, I was reading soft copies. So thank you very much for that. And I was a little hesitant to accept the invite or challenge given by Professor Charan because I was traveling, came to Bangalore yesterday, and I could read book only this morning. And normally that's my peaceful time to read, morning 4 to 6, 7, 8 o'clock, which I did. And I congratulate Mr. Sabnavis because when I was reading it, it's coming to my mind what I was reading all along from March 2020 onwards. Well, what was happening in the country, the world, in the courts, etc. Everything was coming. And I was so moved on this last paragraph of his introduction, preface, where he mentions about his father. And that's a very emotional issue. And I marked certain words he have used in the book, which show the kind of emotions that drove you while drafting the first manuscript. Tamasha, a word he used. Inhuman, slums, bribe, exploitative. These are the words which are used in the book and which are very serious in the sense of understanding the circumstances that people passed through at the time. The lockdown is economic lockdown, that's the theme of the book, but it also impacted, in a way we can say it was a cultural lockdown, it was social lockdown. because no marriages, no get-togethers, no socializing, no clubs, no golf. Ditto with cultural, no temples, no masses, perhaps only place of worship working on philanthropy in terms of gurudwaras. This impacted all these things, so behavioral impact was there. Coming to economic aspect, I tried to read the book from a particular framework, that how did it impact firms budget, household budget, government budgets, which has been brought up very clearly by Mr. Sabnavis. Household budgets went out of control. Firm balance sheets are adversely affected, and governments ran deficit from local municipal government, state government to central government. So that's economic side. Now, how did it impact the markets? Yes, it impacted all the markets, factor markets and product markets. Commodity markets improved. I was just thinking about one commodity, milk. I think that was the only commodity whose prices were not impacted. Our supply system was dislocated. Otherwise, every other commodity supply system was dislocated. Because milk procurement was being done, maybe because we have a very good collection system, and dairy farms are processing it, collecting it, purifying it, or pasteurizing it, packing it, and retail distribution was taking place. Just that at retail point, there is some kind of reorganization. Otherwise, everybody was getting milk supply as it was. But that was the only product which was not dislocated. Land markets, yes. In urban areas, rental markets were affected. In states, asset purchases came down. I guess their stamp duty also came down. Labor market was affected, and we have about 11 High Court judgments and 2-3 Supreme Court judgments on the issue. If anybody compiles those judgments, I think we get authentic information, unlike surveys. I don't mean surveys are bad or not authentic, but the documents that are there with the High Court judgments are submitted by both the parties on oath. So that gives authentic information, authentic standard policy background for everything. So that every judgment made a comment on the labor market of every kind. But what was surprising is impact on capital markets. What was the price index in March 2020? What is the BSE's sensitive index in March 2020 and March 2022? How this was immune to negative effect, rather it got a good effect, and why it happened, I think that is an issue that has to probe, not immediately, but there were many reasons that need to be looked at. And I also congratulate Mr. Sabnavis because he relied upon many surveys from Ajim Premji University, JLL survey, SEAT survey, CARE survey, FICCI survey, and few other surveys, and that a lot of effort was made to state the facts. So therefore, it can be an authentic reference. And I noticed one word you used, and I admire for that. Revealed ideology. This government's revealed ideology is enabler of growth, not instrument of growth. If that was the driver of government policies during fiscal stimulus, I think it has been captured very well. I try to see the difference between USA and UK. Both are democracies. One is federal, another is unitary. And India is that as soon as stimulus was announced, their national auditors, GAO in USA and NAO in UK, they immediately started monitoring the fiscal stimulus performance and giving monthly reports back. And their parliamentary committees are also, congressional committees are also taking those inputs. Perhaps in India's policy system, that accountability system was missing because that was giving feedback. That feedback, authentic feedback from a neutral perspective, was missing for the government. Therefore, most of the decisions were ad hoc or on the basis of public perception and political pressures, which are normal in any democracy because after all, it's political economy. For instance, USA has they have immediately opened coronavirus oversight, started giving reports. And thankfully, OECD as well as IMF also created dashboards and compiled policy decisions by country-wise. So there's a lot of data. Every country was doing, because that was the 20 months was the period in the world that every country, every executive was thinking about only one problem, which perhaps never happened, except during World War. And in this background, two things I thought I made particular mention. GDP projections for fiscal ratios. This came up in the book and also in your conversation just now. The bias of upward projection of the denominator, that is GDP, at the time of setting of fiscal ratios is something, because the GDP projections used for budget projections, I think there is no independent validation for that. The producer of the GDP projection, the denominator used for fiscal ratios, and the user and the communicator all in one. Perhaps from this, the single statement you have made brings out a need for independent validation of GDP numbers projected, whereas the estimates is the job of CSO, and projections is done in DEA North Block. But there has to be independent validation of GDP numbers, which should be submitted along with the budget to the parliament, which is a missing element. Therefore, we get into fiscal ratios and end of the year debate, and volumes are written on that. This, perhaps as a policy, it can come. And proper tracking of every fiscal announcement, which is also missing. If we go deeper into what Mr. Sabnavis was saying, is that proper tracking of fiscal policy decisions, if CAG can be made or suitably made competent or institutionalized, this can be done. And I look forward for 16th Finance Commission, which will have to review all this fiscal performance of all the government budgets from all the 29 states and the 30 states and the government of India, for the terms of reference to be drafted end of the year. Perhaps they should include particular term and create a mechanism in fiscal in the Finance Commission to assess all the fiscal stimulus policy decisions taken and its impact independently by Finance Commission. From that, there can be many lessons which will come from a neutral body. So the coming Finance Commission, perhaps, because these are the thoughts which emerged while reading the book, therefore I'm mentioning it here. So a special task can be given to Finance Commission to assess and lessons to be learned from COVID lockdown and its economic impact. And with this, I think I covered given time. And the way forward lessons learning, I have one, I don't say disagreement. You mentioned about real estate, how offices should be organizing, hospitality industry should reorganize, reinvent themselves. On school education also, you have mentioned some reference that online education is going to increase. But what I see, which neither you have seen nor I have seen till recent past, that National Achievement Survey says that the online education, online teaching was imposing more burden on students, and it exposed the digital divide of the country. So if that can be expanded as for learning lessons, particularly for digital divide and online learning, particularly for school children. Adults like us, we can manage, but school children, their peer learning and their playground and their socialization, etc., all happens in the schools. So that should not be missed. So except on that point, I agree with whatever you have written, and as it sets an agenda not only for all of us, whoever is thinking, but I'm sure the wise men also pick up something for the Finance Commission to look into these things, so that government and all of us will have an independent assessment of what happened during pandemic fiscal stimulus. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Prasad. That's very insightful comments. Dr. Singh, do you have any time for Q&A, or you have overshoot the time?
Actually, we have overshot the time, but the discussion has been so rich. Can we take a question or two?
Yes, maybe next 2 to 3 minutes. There's one question, incidentally, in the chat box. Mr. Sanyala asked that I would like to know your views on precautionary demand for money and its influence on bank savings.
I think what we have seen, I think one phenomenon which we have seen is that currency in circulation has increased substantially since 2020. And I think that one of the indications out here is that people are holding on to more cash because of the precautionary motive. Because COVID has taught us that if at all there is ever any kind of a calamity at home, you need to go to the hospital. And what we saw during the COVID times was that hospitals became exploitative. They would always ask cash down before you take your treatment. So I think that's one thing, one reason why we have seen a sudden increase in the holding of currency.
Last one, any other question? Yes, please. Yes, please, Professor Ashok.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Madan, my dear friend Devi Prasad. It was a very, very good, rich discussions. My question to Mr. Madan, your book, though I have read only the little bit, but not the whole. But on the lockdown, there had been a lot of rental dip on the, because many big companies were vacating their rental space. So how do you see, will it recover from that loss, or now they will become the habituated to work from home and their other places? That is one. Second is regarding during the COVID period, there was a lot of domestic violence, and that also gave a lot of different household kind of the relationship within that. Do you have any comment on that? And one more question to Mr. Devi Prasad. Devi Prasad was suggesting that the NSO, I mean, he was referring to CSO, but now it is named as National Statistical Office, NSO. Now they do the advanced estimate, they compile the data on GDP, GVA, but the forecast is done by other agencies. So there is a kind of mismatch, and then perhaps he was suggesting that we should give the responsibility to the NSO or the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation, and that will also give a quality of the data in a more robust manner.
Okay, see, on the two questions, one of them I could definitely address, because what we have seen in corporate India is that this hybrid mode of work has definitely caught on. And progressively, we have seen that companies are finding that there is a lot of saving to be made in terms of office space, in terms of rentals, by actually giving up space, because they're able to get the same work done by the people. And one should remember that work from home may be efficient for offices, but definitely at the individual level, it does put a lot of pressure, because people generally are expected to be on call right up to 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock in the night, which is not the case when you're going to an office. So I think this is going to be a kind of a transformation taking place. And it could be, of course, it could be more of, I would say, industry specific, may not be across the board. But definitely, I've seen that if you're looking at, say, management consultancy, looking at the IT sector, in the services sector, I think we have seen that a large part of this has actually moved to this hybrid thing. Now, in terms of the social issue which you meant about violence at home, yes, this is something which we have read about, not just in India, but also in other countries. In fact, it's been more severe in the Western countries, but I don't think this kind of thing is something which is documented. It's more based on anecdotes where somebody says such a thing has happened. Because normally when you carry out such a kind of surveys, nobody actually speaks out, nobody actually talks about it. But I think this has definitely been one of the major concerns. Lots of people have been psychologically affected, especially the women folk, on account of these kind of lockdowns. I think Dr. Devi Prasad can take the third question.
Yes, thank you, Vishandas. Good to see you, though we spoke over phone. And but for COVID, we could have met personally. Right. Now, about this GDP estimates. Now, the job done by Minister of Statistics, CSS, NSSO now is well established. There are manuals, and that methodology is followed in every country. UN system of statistics, national account statistics prevails, and India is a beneficiary or member on that. And Ministry of Statistics is nodal ministry for that purpose. Whereas the projections of GDP for the purpose of fiscal ratios is under FRBM Act. Now, FRBM Act implementation is a task given to Ministry of Finance. Now, that task cannot be transferred unless there is amendment in the Act. But whatever happens, these are projections. There are no manual, there are no methods. So there has to be some kind of guidelines and independent validation. For instance, in UK, all the budget estimates, expenditure revenue side, at least 5 assumptions. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Can you hear me, sir?
Yes, yes.
Yes, we can hear you. Please.
Okay.
Carry on.
The budget estimates, the receipt side and expense side, five or six assumptions are independently validated by Office of Budget Responsibility. And that report is presented to House of Commons. In our case, if not budget numbers, at least the GDP which is used to fix our fiscal targets every year, let it be validated by some independent entity. That can be anybody. And government can ensure secrecy required, but today, all in one. I make the projections, I use the projections, I communicate the projections. I was OSD FRBM. So there is a need for institutional changes. That is a system we created, we inherited, we are using it. Nothing wrong. But we have to evolve. That's what I'm saying.
So great.
Thank you.
So I believe, Dr. Singh, we have no time for any other question. I personally enjoyed it. This discussion, very rich discussion. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Partha. This was an exceedingly good discussion. Right from, and I always say, economics has to have a human face. And Madan certainly covered in his book, at least in the argument that he presented, how from the human face, he started looking deeper into the issues and then gave us a very, I would say, a very impartial analysis. We all agree that this was a very tough time. And in this tough time, there are no black and white answers. This is a debate which is going on. And I think in his book, in his presentation, he has covered it so well. I must thank Mr. Devi Prasad for an excellent discussant's role. And I am firmly of the view that in the next Finance Commission, we will have to look at an independent body, something like the CBO, which evaluates things and then mentions about it. So I agree with you, the terms of reference probably would need to be added this time. Must thank you for that. Thank also the chairman for bringing in pertinent issues regarding this book and flagging them. We are out of time. I must thank the discussants and the speaker and the chairman, plus some questions which have been raised. I'm sure this is going to be important discussion because it has fiscal implications. The recording of this will be available on our website by noon tomorrow. I will myself be sending it to a few friends in MOF. I'm sure all of you may like to use and send that recording to important policymakers so that the benefit of today's discussion is over a longer period. My concerns are there are lessons to learn from the book and the discussion that we have had today in case, again, COVID is coming and showing up its face. Do we go in for a lockdown or do we have an alternative? And in future, in something like this happens, what is the way forward? So therefore, I am mentioning that it has important policy implications and you may like to use the recording to share it with your policy making friends so that in future we are able to come out with a better evolved solution to this problem. I am happy to announce next week 2:30 to 3:30 we have a discussion from Professor Alok Pandey, Dr. Alok Pandey, on corporate bond market. So I would invite you, I'll send you all the details within a day. I would invite you to spare time from 2:30 to 3:30 on June 3 to discuss the corporate bond market. With that, let me conclude and thank you once again for being with us and participate in this important discussion. Thank you, Madan, for sharing your book with all of us. Thank you very much.
And Dr. Charan Singh, I'd like to thank you for being very generous and calling me today here to make this presentation. And thanks a lot, Dr. Ray and Dr. Devi Prasad.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So let me log out now.
Yes, I'm logging out.
Sure.